Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures weekly chart analysis for the week ending 17th of October 2025. The first chart is the US dollar index futures. They traded lower this week, but within the range of the previous bar as an inside bar. Price did make a brief attempt to move higher, but then pulled back on low volume, below average volume for the week. There was no serious attempt to move higher. It floated higher and then pulled back, trading within the previous bar's range on lower volume. You always expect volume to be a little lower when it trades back through the range of the previous bar, and that's what happened this week. The lower close did allow some of the other associated markets, in particular the currencies, to float a little higher. But this week, to some extent, was really a nothing bar. Price just drifted lower on lower volume. The E-mini S&P 500 index futures, they floated higher, but on high volume. Spread was relatively narrow, and price traded inside the range of the previous bar. There was no serious challenge to the important level, the highs above. And you can see that price has been trading just in that little range there for the most part over the last 2 weeks. There was certainly no serious challenge to the highs of the range to break out. And to some extent, this was a nothing bar as well, with price just happy to float inside the previous bar's range. The next chart is a 10-year note futures. They attempted to push higher this week, but encountered some supply. You can see here the close well off the week's high. There was a challenge to this level. This is an intermediate high, a high within the overall range. The overall range being from here to here, the range of this widespread down bar on high volume. And price did move up and issue a challenge to this intermediate high here. But supply was drawn out. You can see that with the increased and above average volume. And price pulled back to the relative safety found just below those highs. The pressing nature to the upside continues in this market, and I would expect a secondary attempt to move higher, perhaps following some testing for supply prior to the challenge. You'll see something like that, and then a challenge to move higher again if supply is found to be low. This is copper price futures, and copper price futures also traded inside the previous bar's range this week. Price did attempt to push higher on reasonable volume, but eventually closed just a little below mid-bar, suggesting that there is some supply in this market, which isn't surprising. You've got the highs coming through there now, little intermediate highs within this bar's range. There was no attempt to trade below the previous bar's close, testing for supply. Price was trying to move higher overall. And that may suggest to you that this week's bar was actually some form of an absorption bar, where price moved up and drifted lower in a by the offer sort of fashion. And that'll be confirmed or not next week. If the market does attempt to continue higher, then this week's bar will probably prove to be some form of absorption. Gold price futures. Gold price futures looks a little climactic this week. Have to see how that turns out. Really widespread up bar on very high volume, which encountered supply and has closed mid-bar. I was watching it last night, and the start of the European session saw increased supply drawn out, and that supply persisted into the US session, and you've eventually got a mid-bar close. this market's been super strong. I expected there may have been some testing for supply in response to last week's bar, but that never happened at all. There was no attempt to test for supply whatsoever, despite price closing off last week's high. This market has been super strong. So it will be interesting to see what happens in response to this bar. In a normal market, you would suggest that this may be some form of climactic action, but this market hasn't been following the normal patterns more recently. So it will be interesting to see just how the market plays this, whether it just attempts to continue higher again, or whether price does come back and at least test for supply. That would be the expectation, a test for supply at the very least, and then a deeper pullback if supply continues, and an attempt to push higher if supply is found to be low. But interesting market for sure, and well worth watching next week. Silver price futures, very similar to the gold market. It does look climactic, but these haven't been normal markets just more recently. This is a serious attack on the market. I also expected a test for supply in response to last week's bar. This week, there was no attempt. Price just moved higher as soon as markets opened at the start of the week, and they were really accelerating higher in the last couple of days before the supply was encountered during the European session yesterday. And that supply persisted into the US session. Similar to the gold price futures, you would expect in a normal market at least a test for supply in response to this sort of bar. You would see price initially come back, and then the close would depend on how much supply is being drawn out. If supply continues to be drawn out, you'd get a poor close and then perhaps a secondary test for supply or pullback to challenge the sellers. If supply is not found to be strong, you'll get a close back up near that bar's high, and then you would see an attempt to push higher in response. And like I said, on the gold price futures, these two markets in particular, gold and silver, have not been trading like normal markets more recently. So there may just be a shrug of the shoulders and an attempt to move higher. So we'll see whether these are trading more like normal markets or not early next week. Like crude price futures continued to drift lower this week. Price broke below the important level last week and into this zone down here. And although spread has narrowed this week and volume remained about average, so it was genuine trading, price did continue lower and traded below the previous bar's close for most of the week. So that's a little bit of weakness that's emerged here. I would expect there'll be an attempt to support the market adjacent to this previous congestion in the past where the market did build up some strength. However, at this point in time, it's only tentative support that's been drawn out. Spread narrowed. There was a slight close off the week's low, but it wasn't serious. You may initially get a pullback again early next week, and then a little bit of buying support come in following that initial pullback. You get something like that. So we'll see how the response goes. It's certainly not looking strong at this point in time. Into the currencies now. This is the Euro-US dollar currency pair. You'll note the US dollar just drifted lower this week, and this market effectively just floated higher, which is the inverse of the US dollar. Price traded inside the range of the previous bar on reduced and slightly below average volume. So this was a bit of a nothing bar, kind of similar to the US, where that was a bit of a nothing bar as well too. Wasn't telling you a great deal, price trading inside the range of the previous bar on reduced volume. See what the pound did. The pound was pretty similar, traded inside the range of the previous bar for most of the week. Just a slight test of the previous bar's low. You can see there. Barring that, prices traded inside the range of the previous bar. Volume remained slightly above average here. So there is some increased activity in this market, which is interesting in itself. That being said, the market still traded inside the range of the previous bar. It did reject moving lower, but that's pretty much because the US dollar was weak itself, and that left this market with a little bit of increased strength. But we'll see how this market trades next week. Japanese yen currency futures, and they floated higher a little as well this week. Although volume was reduced, it remained above the average. You can see. Now, the interesting part of this chart is that price gapped lower here and below this little intermediate level and pushed right down to the lows of the range here. And this week, the market's pushed back up. There was a very minor challenge to this level, and price did just move below it to the relative safety found below that level. So unless the market finds some increased impetus, some force or effort is on display, you'll probably see the market trading in this range now, at least for a little while. Similar to how the market traded in this range for a while. Unless there's some force or effort to do otherwise, there's going to be some form of support found at this level and some form of resistance or supply at this level. That'll leave this market trading in here. Aussie dollar currency futures, and they traded a little higher this week, the inverse of the US dollar, although it was on higher volume, which is a little surprising. Price tested the previous bar's lows, so it was moving lower initially and then recovered at least somewhat on increased volume this week. So that's similar to the pound. There's a bit of increased activity there, which is hard to nail down exactly. We'll have to watch for the response, especially in those two markets, and see if that increased volume or increased activity was able to be determined. Overall, this market's looking a little weaker than some of the other currencies, which traded inside the range of the previous bar for almost the entire week. This market's only just holding on to the lows of the previous bar. So this market's trading a little weaker than the other currencies, especially the pound and the euro. Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures traded lower this week. There was no attempt to move higher. Price pushed below the previous bar's low and continued down. It moved through this intermediate level and down to what you would call the lows of the range at this point in time. A clear break below this level would see these levels down here come into play. I expect an attempt to support the market, and you saw a little bit already at this level next week. It was surprising the market never attempted to move higher this week, but there was no attempt whatsoever to move higher. It was supply being drawn out all week, and you can see that the supply was meaningful on the above average volume. Price just pushed down. It did find some support later in the week, right at the lows of this range down here. The response is going to be very important here. A clear break and close below this level next week would certainly see the market looking towards these levels down here to look for support. That's quite a bit lower than we've seen the market trade for a while. So I expect some sort of defence at these lows down here, and we'll see how the market trades. But I do expect the market will attempt to defend against supply and hold on to these levels. Just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. You can pretty much see what's happened this week. Apart from a minor attempt to move higher above the previous bar's close, the market just drifted lower on reduced and below average volume inside the range of the previous bar. There was no intent being shown. There was no testings of the highs or the lows. The bar wasn't really indicating its true intentions at this point. So just watch for the response next week and see how the market trades. I do expect that trading above this level is going to be more difficult than it was trading at this level. And it would take a clear break and close below this level for the market to look really weak. So it's probably going to trade sideways because under these circumstances, that's generally what happens. But if we do see some intent being shown, price moving above the highs of this previous bar range here or below its lows, whether it's the traded lows here or the lows of the range there, and we get some intent, so that means volume average or slightly above average, then we'll see how the market's playing. At this point in time, I think it's going to be more difficult for the market to push above this level. It's going to be much easier for the market to trade within this level. And it's less likely at this point in time, but still always possible, that the market does challenge these lows at some point. So interesting times, no doubt. Thanks for tuning in. Back again next week. See ya.